I'm going to introduce today's speaker. He comes from George Mason University, where he is a professor of economics, and he is also the general director of the Mercatus Center. His name is Tyler Cowen. He's an accomplished writer. He's written a few books. His most recent book, before the one we're going to discuss today, was Markets and Cultural Voices, which explains the effect of globalization on the lives of the Mexican Amate artists. He's also written a book called Creative Destruction, a book called What Price Fame, and also In Praise of Commercial Culture. He is also co-author of a very popular blog, marginalrevolution.com, so be sure to check that out if you haven't already. And we're excited to have him today. He has spoken to policymakers on a wide array of issues. I think already this year he's talked on issues like microfinance. He's talked on the avian flu epidemic. He's also talked to chiefs of staff about music, rock and roll, and globalization. So his breadth of knowledge is wide, and we're pleased to have him. Please help me welcome Dr. Tyler Cowen.
Just this last week, I published a book called Discover Your Inner Economist. Use incentives to fall in love, survive your next meeting, and motivate your dentist. At the very end, I'll give you my tips for falling in love. But today, we're mostly going to do Discover Your Inner Policy Economist. And the central idea of this book, as evidenced by the carrot on the cover, is the idea of incentives. I think in economics there are really three major ideas that stand out above all others. One is incentives, the second is opportunity cost, and the third is gains from trade. We're going to touch on each of these, but my focus will be incentives. What I'm going to do is take what I think are three of the biggest issues today and give you my personal point of view on how an economist would approach them, focusing on this idea of incentives. So I'm going to touch on immigration, healthcare, and taxes. Three of the perennial issues. Let's start with immigration. Why is immigration potentially a problem in the United States? The core issue is very simple. The wage difference between rich countries and poor countries is a very big one. As noted, my previous book was on Mexico. It was on the Mexican countryside. I've done a lot of field work in rural Mexican villages, and I've lived there for weeks at a time. Life there is very tough. The village I lived in, there were no stores, there was no way I could take a shower, and the people I stayed with, if they earned $2 a day rather than $1 a day, they were pretty happy. Now, if the people from that village come to the United States, if they move, say, to Houston, rather than earning $1 a day, they will earn about $10 an hour working in the supermarket. So the incentive for that person to come to Houston, whether legally or not, is really a pretty strong incentive. It's $1 a day versus $10 an hour. There are now a lot of proposals that have been talked about and in fact recently rejected, though some of them are coming back to life, about how we could make the immigration problem better or how we could improve things. But I think a lot of what's proposed, even if they're good ideas, these proposals won't solve, quote-unquote, the immigration problem because they don't address underlying incentives. So let me mention a few of these ideas briefly. One idea is that America should take in more skilled labor and should have a higher degree of legal immigration. This, I think, is a good idea. I think we're taking in not nearly enough, say, high-tech workers from Sweden. But taking in more people legally won't solve the illegal immigration problem. In fact, it will in some ways make it more severe. That is, the more legal or high-skilled people that are taken in by the United States, the greater will be the demand for people who come to the United States and work for this $10 an hour. The same is true of a guest worker program. People often have in their mind that if we institute a guest worker program, the result is that people who are illegal immigrants will now become guest workers. Let me just say in passing, I think a guest worker program is a fairly reasonable idea. A good guest worker program I would favor. But again, a guest worker program doesn't get at the incentives underlying illegal immigration. A guest worker program will somehow ration who becomes a guest worker. Those guest workers will come to the United States. They will produce more wealth. This will be good for them. It will be good for most, but not all of us. The result will be we are richer and we will again have a greater demand to hire illegal immigrants at $10 an hour. The point here is that the incentive is not just to trade with any old person, but we, most of us are wealthier people or will be wealthier people, we have incentives to trade with people who will work for a lower wage. And the people who will work for lower wages will, as a general rule, be illegal immigrants. With the very fact of their illegality, the fact that they're not putting down roots, the fact that no employer wants to invest in their training, will make them, in general, lower wage workers. So another solution to the immigration problem you often hear, and just about everyone says this, whether it's on the left wing, the right wing, pro-immigration, anti-immigration, if they're forgetting incentives, they will say the real long-run solution to America's immigration problem is for Mexico or other Latin countries or other poor countries in the world, is for Mexico to become a wealthier nation. And I think maybe in the very, very long run this is the case. So if Mexico on average, say, were as wealthy as Switzerland, the degree of illegal immigration to the United States would be much, much smaller. But in general, at the relevant margin, given possible changes we face in the world today, what basically happens is that as Mexico becomes wealthier, the number of illegal immigrants to the United States tends to go up rather than down. That if you're working and earning in Mexico, say, $1 a day, let's say for this class of person, Mexico were to become twice as wealthy, all of a sudden you would be earning $2 a day, and in Houston, a job in a supermarket beckons for $10 an hour. Typically, people in that situation, they either want to go or they don't. The upgrade from $1 to $2 a day, not that many of them say, well, at $2 a day, I'm pretty rich here in my village, I'm not going to leave. What actually happens is at $2 a day, they're able to save up enough money to buy a bus ticket to the border to try and cross, or to hire a coyote for the $1,500 or $2,000 that it takes. And the wealthier Mexico gets, which I'm all in favor of, we're all in favor of, is actually at the relevant margin going to mean there will be more illegal immigrants rather than few illegal immigrants. Another solution, or proposed solution we often hear, is that somehow we need to crack down on the border, we need to get tougher, we need to have greater penalties for people who hire illegal immigrants, and so on. There are a lot of complexities to these proposals, but the basic economic understanding of incentives is just to say, well, look, before we do anything too hastily, we need to think twice about what will the incentives be. And the incentives are actually pretty simple. And the people I speak to in my Mexican village, they're pretty clear about it when I talk to them. The last time I was in my village last year, the going rate for crossing the border, it was about $1,500 to $2,000 to hire a coyote and get across the border. And there's also some amount of personal risk. The people who are going illegally, most of them don't want to stay forever. What they want to do is go there for a while, work, and eventually come back. When the price of crossing the border goes up, be that the price to hire a coyote, or the price in terms of the trouble they have to go to get the job, or the papers they need to forge, as the price needed to cross the border goes up, plans change. How is it that plans change? What's your incentive? Your incentive is to cross the border and stay here for a longer period of time. Think about it. Let's say you're taking a vacation in Europe and the price of a plane ticket goes up. Some people won't take the vacation. Other people will say, well, flying to Europe costs more money, therefore I'm going to stay longer. That's responding to an incentive. If the price doubles, you don't go for a weekend trip to London, but you might take a 2-week holiday in Florence and Rome. So basically what happens is that the harder it is to cross the border, those people who do cross, they stay here for longer. There are even people in the immigration debate who have suggested that there would be fewer illegal immigrants in the United States in terms of long-run flow if it were easier to go back home. And in essence, you have a lot of people deciding to spend 6 months here out of the year, 6 months in Mexico, if they could simply cross back and forth. So there are a bunch of points that have been made, but they're all getting back to this common thread that the decision to immigrate and the decision to immigrate illegally is driven by incentives. It's driven by that difference in wages. And the 4 or 5 major proposals for cutting off illegal immigration, on both sides of the fence really, they haven't fully thought through how incentives work. And a lot of these proposals, they may have other merits. They may help us crack down on terrorists. They may put in place a good guest worker program. They may bring over some high-tech engineers from Sweden, whatever. But they're not actually resolving the illegal immigration problem. My personal view, this is a mix of my personal opinion and my training as an economist, is that America currently does immigration fairly well by global standards. And I think what we'll end up doing is learning to live with what we've got. And I think it's not quite as horrible as people say it is, the status quo. But the bottom line problem is this: America is a big country. In an ideal world, you would have different immigration policies for different parts of the country. This is not at all possible. It's not desirable given our Constitution. The current immigration policy basically puts a disproportionate burden on border states, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, California, because those are the parts of the United States closest to Latin America. And parts of the country that are further away typically have smaller problems with immigration. It's not possible to have one immigration law for Wisconsin and one immigration law for, say, San Antonio. So what we end up with is one national law, and some parts of the country always being unhappy in one direction, and other parts of the country, say Seattle, being unhappy in the other direction. And that's national government. So I think there, the understanding of incentives, the policy lessons, when we chat with our inner policy economists, is to think that a lot of things we see as a problem are probably the necessary result of America being a rich country and having some poorer neighbors. And as a whole, America does a pretty good job with its immigration problem. If you were to say to Western European nations, would you trade in your immigration problem for that of America? Most of them would make that trade in a heartbeat, and there's a lesson there. Anyway, those are some remarks on immigration and incentives. Let's look at another big problem, which is healthcare. I think healthcare is a bit like immigration. It's an area where no matter what we do, we cannot solve all of our major problems. That is, large numbers of people will be unhappy with the healthcare or immigration system we choose, no matter what. And in healthcare, there's what Arnold Kling calls the Kling trilemma. And there are three features of a healthcare system we all would like to have. Let me list those. A, it should be cheap. B, it should cover financial risk for most of us or all of us. And C, it should cover all of us and give us some kind of insurance or coverage. Those are three principles. You hear them, you nod, you think, yes, I want that. I want cheap. I don't want to go bankrupt from healthcare bills. I actually want to be able to get medical care rather than have it be denied me, whether it's by an HMO or a government or because I can't pay for it or whatever institutions. Those sound like perfectly reasonable requests. But in healthcare policy, Kling's theorem or Kling's trilemma is that to satisfy all three of these at the same time is probably impossible. I do think there are major improvements in terms of incentives we could make with our healthcare system. But the basic problem, again, is one of incentives. How many of you here have seen Michael Moore's movie Sicko? None of you? It's a very unusual audience I'm speaking to. I've actually only read the relevant parts of the transcript. I can read more quickly than I can sit in a movie theater and hear it. But the classic example that is brought up again and again is something like comparing the United States, forget about Cuba, but comparing the United States to France or other Western European nations. But as probably all of you know, the United States spends a higher percentage of its GDP on medical care than does France. Yet people in this country are not healthier than people in France. In fact, according to some metrics, you could argue the French are healthier. And the French, when you speak to them, they seem fairly well satisfied with their healthcare system. They seem to be spending less and getting more. Now, why might this be the case? Again, I think we need to look at incentives to understand the difference between the American healthcare system and the French healthcare system. It's not that widely known in this country what is the average doctor's salary in France. The average doctor, I mean doctor, not nurse, not paramedic, doctor. The average doctor's salary in France, plus vacation, of course. But that salary is about $50,000 a year. In America, depending on how you measure it, it can be $300,000 to $400,000 a year. Now, we can debate whether it's a good thing or a bad thing that doctors in this country are paid so much. Here, nurses are paid more, technicians are paid more, medical machines cost more, not always by that same percentage, but just think about it. $50,000 a year compared to, say, $350,000, $400,000 a year. And labor costs being a big part of the cost of medical care. That, in a nutshell, is the fundamental reason why France pays less and gets more. Because things there, in terms of wages and other costs, they're simply cheaper. There's another very important difference between the French system and the American system. And again, you might think it's good or bad. You might think it's good or bad that doctors are paid this much or less. But just take it as a fact for the time being. That in the United States, most medical care, not all, but most, is sold to people on something called fee-for-service. And if your doctor, your hospital, your group, one way or another, sells you more, sells your insurance company more, they get paid more. Not every form of an HMO works that way, but most care, more selling, more payment. Very simple formula. The incentive then on the supply side is, obviously, to sell more. In France and a lot of Western Europe, medical care is organized very differently. You have small practices, and they're organized on the basis of a fixed salary. So the doctor or medical assistant you see gets paid the same amount, whether you are given more care or less care. What then is the incentive? The incentive is to give you less care. Now, I'm not here to tell you some horror story about how everyone in Europe is lined up in some big queue, waiting for a hip replacement, like up in Canada, and that they're dropping like flies in the street and they're ailing and bleeding. It's not the way it is. People in Western Europe, if you adjust for relevant demographics, are on average probably somewhat healthier than people in the United States. They're getting less care, but what pops up in the numbers when you look at these statistics is that in countries like the United States, we're getting a lot of forms of care that aren't actually helping us very much. They're not making us healthier. And we're getting this extra care, we're paying for it. It's a mix of two factors. One is we're getting it because doctors, hospitals, whatever, have this incentive to sell it to us. The other is that a lot of us just like to feel that we've done everything possible. I have this feeling myself. I'm what you would call in some ways a healthcare cynic, as it may be coming across a bit. But a few times I've been to a doctor's office, a dentist's office. They tell me I should get something done. And you're there like at the dentist, you're sitting in the chair, your mouth's open, you're like tied up, you're drugged, they've stuck needles in you. And you've submitted yourself to this man. And he comes in and he's calm and reassuring. And he tells you what you should have done. And people very often, they do it. If they don't do it, or if you don't have it done for your kid or your wife, and then something happens, you feel bad. So in part, we're spending money on feeling better. And in part, we're spending money because suppliers have a greater incentive to push it on us. But there are a lot of studies, even for elderly people. There are some areas where the elderly will see doctors at a rate twice as high as other areas, or they'll get Medicare services, Medicare payments at a rate twice as high as other areas. Adjusting for demographics, the people getting twice as much care, they do not in any way seem to be healthier. What actually correlates with health, yes, most of all, is social status, education, and exercise. So be educated, have high status, and exercise if you want to be healthy. And what we call the marginal product of healthcare is actually pretty iffy. So it's a very funny sector. America, for better or worse, has specialized in a way of doing things where we pay doctors a lot, we give them very high status, we give them a lot of incentives to sell us more care. We do in a bunch of ways get more care, we have a lot more expensive procedures. In some ways this pays off, in a lot of ways it doesn't. So we spend way more and have a somewhat questionable return. Those are the basic incentives, how things are working. But if someone comes along to you and says, this is the classic warning sign for an economist, I have a free lunch, In Western Europe, people are healthier and care is cheaper. Therefore, in the United States, we should supply medical care the same way it's supplied in Western Europe. Your inner economist, your inner policy economist, he says, wait, we need to think about incentives. The only way we could do that, to mimic the low-cost structure, say, of France, would be to pay doctors, say, $50,000 a year, and somehow, moving from the status quo to organize them into practices. I'm asking how this would actually happen, where they're not paid more for selling more medical care to patients or insurance companies. And the view is, my view is, this is impossible for the United States. The United States, in a way, has specialized in spending too much money. The European systems, they don't really admit it, but they work well because they cut out a lot of things that don't make us that much healthier anyway. What the U.S. system does do extremely well is fund innovation. So most Nobel Prizes related to medicine come from the United States. They don't all come from people born in America, but they come from research done or applied or created or turned into something usable in the United States. And that's because here wages are so high, prices are so high. So the United States, because of incentives again, is supplying this considerable public good, medical research, to the entire world. The rest of the world, to some extent, is a big free rider on the U.S. And all of us who are paying these higher prices, there's an indirect subsidy there. We're getting a very expensive deal. It's not clear to me we have a way to make it much cheaper. And it's not clear to me we're always healthier. But again, if you want to be healthy, look for status in life. Seems to be what the data tells us. Just in passing, I often get asked quite a bit about health savings accounts, the initiative from the Bush administration. What do I think of health savings accounts? That's a complicated question, but just to briefly apply this idea of incentives again, a health savings account, of course, is an incentive to save more money. And in theory, those funds are used for health care. I think really a health savings account is most of all an incentive to save. It's a tax incentive to save. I don't think it will ever be done on a large enough scale anytime soon that it will make a big difference in our healthcare system. So I don't really view it as healthcare policy. I view it as tax policy. In general, I'm for tax incentives to save. We already have quite a few of them. Ways of saving that lower your taxes. IRAs are one of many. So having another one to me is not a huge gain. I don't think it will ever make medical care cheaper in this country. I don't think it's in any way addressing what I described before as the fundamental incentive-driven reasons why medical care is so expensive. It will pull some people out of medical insurance, a certain amount, but it will basically be the wealthier people, where the insurance is not a big factor in their financial stability anyway. So in that regard, I don't think the greater degree of cost consciousness will be enough to overturn the whole system of incentives where the doctor has an incentive to sell you something. You're timid, you're afraid, you want to show you care for your family members, your son, your daughter. You have an incentive to buy it. Quantity, supply goes up, price goes up, costs go up. Medical care costs more and more. It's unclear how much healthier we get. That basic dynamic currently, I think, is rooted in human nature, and health savings accounts are not really overturning it. So I'd say I can see a reason for having them based on tax policy, but they're not really changing what's going on. Okay, so those are some very brief remarks on medical care. Final topic I want to touch on, and then we'll get to questions, and maybe a little bit on falling in love. But the final topic is on taxation. And we all know what the big debate has been recently, or series of debates. It's about what I call the Warren Buffett fact. How many of you here have heard the Warren Buffett fact? More of you than have seen Sicko. The Warren Buffett fact is this. Warren Buffett, he wrote some op-eds, he was on TV. He said, it sounded so startling to people. Warren Buffett said, the tax rate I paid last year, I think he said it was 17.7%. That's the Warren Buffett fact. And then Warren Buffett said, my secretary, who just paid some ordinary salary, the tax rate she paid last year is 30%. You hear that and you think, how can that be right? How can it be fair that Warren Buffett, one of the richest men in the world, pays 17%, and his secretary, or me I might add, I pay more than 30%, is paying 30%. That's the Warren Buffett fact. Some of you may recall the last election. Some Republicans made a big deal out of the fact that the Kerry family, the year before the election, had paid an average tax rate of, I think, 12%. Back then it was the Kerry fact. Now it's the Warren Buffett fact. Now, how is this the case? You hear this and you wonder, what is wrong with our tax system? How could this possibly come to pass? And it's pretty simple why it is that some wealthier people, or even a lot of wealthier people, are paying lower rates of taxation. Because a lot of Warren Buffett's income is taken in the form of capital gains rather than salary. Warren Buffett or the Kerry family, or me for that matter, if I had capital gains this year, I don't think I do actually. If I had capital gains, I'd be paying a low tax rate. I just don't have capital gains. So I'm paying 30+%, and Buffett Secretary is paying 30%. So the obvious conclusion is something like, well, let's raise the rate of taxation on capital gains to set this right. Make Warren Buffett pay more. Buffett himself said this. And again, tax policy is pretty complicated. We have a pretty big deficit. It's actually not as big as we thought it would be 2 years ago. But still, it has to be paid off. So if someone says we need to somehow pay off the deficit, this is a serious argument. And we do need to do something to restore fiscal solvency. So I don't think we should dismiss this argument. And I think we also need to think through, what are the incentives if we raise the rate of taxation on capital gains? Let's just take a thought experiment. Let's say we would raise the rate of taxation on capital gains to 80%. Higher than it's ever been in the history of the United States. Imagine a rate of taxation of 80%. What is it that would happen? You would have a lot of people in any given year, they buy a book like this called Capital Gains, Minimal Taxes. Can you imagine what's inside this book? Or if you wouldn't buy the book, you would have an incentive to hire a tax accountant who had mastered this book. Well, I have a PhD in economics, and one of my fields in graduate school was public finance. I took public finance from Larry Summers. I had a great public finance class. I tried to read this book. What do you predict was the result? How many pages into this book do you think I got? If we look, it's about 30 or 40 pages. But this book has a lot of interesting lessons. No one should do tax policy without at least trying to read this book. And trying and failing will teach you more than trying and finishing, believe me. But one of the lessons is this. So I got this lesson. There's something called loss offsets. And a loss offset is that if you sell a winner and you sell a loser, that the win and the loss, it's more complicated than this, but they cancel each other out. And you're paying zero in net terms on the winner and the loser. So if you raise the rate of taxation on capital gains, say to 80%, even 70%, 50%, the incentive of investors is to buy a lot more different stocks, not just to put all their holdings into Berkshire Hathaway, but to diversify their portfolios. And any time you want to sell a winner and reap a capital gain, what will you do at the same time? To sell a loser, you'll pick up a copy of this book. And basically, the people who are able to diversify and have a lot of winners and losers in a given year, those are the people who, there'll be a new fact. It won't be the Kerry fact. It won't be the Warren Buffett fact. It'll be the fact of some other person. The fact of the well-diversified wealthy investor who in some year pays the capital gains tax rate of 80% and paid a capital gains tax of what? 0. Because of loss offsets. You might then think, well, let's get rid of loss offsets. Or you might think, let's get rid of the fact that when you die and you pass assets onto your heirs, we rescale the basis for capital gains tax. There's some serious proposals on these issues. But again, if you trace them through and you look at incentives, if you got rid of loss offsets, all you'd find people doing is rather than buying a lot of different stocks separately and like selling a winner and loser at the same time, they'd go to a mutual fund. The mutual fund would count like as one asset. The fund itself would balance the winners and losers for people in a way to minimize tax burden. You'd hold your one asset, the mutual fund. It would make sure it didn't have the capital gain. And even if you eliminated loss offsets, what people would do is they would find some other way to repackage assets, whatever, using this book, read it through to the very end, if you can, and they would again, some people, some large number of wealthy people, would pay a very low rate of capital gains taxation. So in my opinion, our tax system definitely should be reformed. I think our tax system should be somewhat progressive. I think people who are wealthier should not only pay more tax, they should pay a higher rate of tax. But to simply look at the Warren Buffett fact and say, we should raise the rate of capital gains taxation, is approaching that problem without having thought through incentives. It's probably not the best way to get to the result we want to get to, which is a more fair tax system, which is not just encourage people to do more in the service of tax evasion. Now, let me just mention love before I finish up and take questions. My book, it's really not about policy at all. If you read the book, I don't know, maybe there's a page or two about policy, but it's not serious talk about policy. My book is about choices we make in our daily lives, but it's applying the same logic of incentives. Take a problem, ask yourself, what incentives do people have? How will people behave? What will they choose? And it's how you can do better in your daily life. So one thing I talk about in the book, for instance, is my wife and I, we once wanted to get our daughter to do the dishes. We thought we had a clever idea. We thought we could pay her to do the dishes. She would do the dishes all the time. That, it turns out, was stupid. It sounds like good economics, but we didn't think through incentives. Her incentive was a little deeper than we had realized. Once we started paying her to do the dishes, she started fearing parental control. Might we next pay her to get better grades, to have a different boyfriend, pay her not to go out late at night? Her incentive was to set a precedent that we can't pay her to do anything. She's also clever. She figures, hey, Mom, they're going to give me a certain amount of money, like at the end of this parenting thing, no matter what. And if they pay me more now, they're just going to give me less later on. So what we thought was the incentive of paying her, she viewed as the incentive of controlling her and not really paying her anything at all. So good economics is also good psychology. There's a section in the book on how to find a better restaurant. There's also an article in yesterday's Washington Post. It's like an interview with me, where I talk about what I call the horrors of Restaurant Week. How you should approach Restaurant Week. My main piece of advice is to avoid it like the plague. Because what they're doing is lowering quality and appealing to what in economics is called the marginal buyer, which is people who don't care that much. Often the best way to find a good restaurant is simply to find a restaurant that's hard to get to. My favorite Chinese restaurant is called Hong Kong Palace. It's at 7 Corners in Falls Church. And I've never met a person there. 6 or 7 times I've met people there. Never, ever has anyone been on time. Because they cannot find out how to get to Hong Kong Palace. You can't see it from the road. The turn-in is poorly marked. You turn into the strip mall, you still can't see it. The nominal street address is not really where it is visually. And they have an unlisted phone number. And the best menu they don't give to people who do not appear to be Chinese or at least Asian. All these facts give me a great faith in the restaurants, because I know Hong Kong Palace is basically for regular loyal buyers. And they're not trying to appeal to like Joe Schmo on the margin who reads about Restaurant Week and thinks, gee, it'd be nice to go to some neat Chinese place that's so authentic. Hong Kong Palace is hard to get to. That's the point. So I want you, for finding a better restaurant, to look for places that are hard to get to. And if you hear it's hard to get to, that means you should want to go. What do I say when it comes to love? Quite a few things. I'll just mention 1 or 2. The first is that there is no simple formula for attracting a potential partner. This comes from what economists call theory of signaling. What we're always doing in life in different ways, we put on a tie, or we get an education, or we try to say the right thing at a bar, whatever. We're trying to signal to other people. But the problem with signals is once a good signal starts working, the so-called losers all tend to copy it. Problem with signals. So if there weren't any simple formula, losers would copy it. And by using the simple formula, you would look like a loser, which of course would be a bad signal. So one piece of advice I give with love is there's no simple formula, whether it be love dating or for that matter, SEX. There's no simple formula that's really going to work. The second piece of advice I give is that people very much, especially when it comes to love, we all tend to self-deceive. And that is, we tend to think we know what we want when we don't. So a simple way of applying this point is that if you're writing a personal ad or putting up a profile, a website, Match.com, whatever, don't be too specific about what you want in the other person, because you think you know, but you don't. And two of the key economic lessons I close the book with. Economics, properly understood, it's not just dollars and cents, it's not just money, it's human behavior. Two of the most important economic lessons. The first is humility, and the second is that it usually pays to be a nice guy. Anyway, that's your inner economist. Today we've talked a bit about your inner policy economist, and we have just a few minutes for questions. Thank you all.
We've got about 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A, but if you could take this time to fill out that blue sheet too, we'd really appreciate it.
Yes, Mr. Clerk? Just a little louder, please.
I have a question about healthcare.
Up here.
I was thinking about regarding insurance companies. It seems like they would have a big incentive to keep costs down, but from what I can tell, they don't do a whole lot in that area. Is there any way to explain that?
That's it's a very good question. It's the central puzzle of healthcare economics. Why don't insurance companies care more about costs? The problem seems to be that insurance companies cut costs often by shedding risky patients. And when insurance companies cut costs by clamping down on fraud, by denying unjust claims, it's hard for an outsider to see. Is the insurance company doing something that's justified or doing something that's screwing over innocent people who paid money for a service and now aren't getting it? So I view the problem as, why don't we have a better way of monitoring and indeed measuring the performance of insurance companies? And we don't. I'm not sure why. I think we could in some ways usefully deregulate the insurance market, have it be far less state by state, have a lot more national competition, have entrepreneurial innovations that would in some way rate quantitatively whether insurance companies are screwing people over, and businesses would look at this information when choosing plans. We should have a tax system that does not channel all health insurance through jobs. This is ultimately a bad idea, even though for the time being I think we're stuck with it. That individuals will in some ways be keener judges of how good the insurance company is than an employer, because you're closer to the person who's going to die. But ultimately we don't know why the insurance market is failing in this fashion. And if there is ever a way of resolving the problem, that's the way to do it. To have private insurance companies perform better than they're doing now. We're not seeing it the way we'd like to. Behind you, fellow in the white t-shirt. You have your hand up? Yes?
No, right here.
Yes.
What, if anything, have you learned from the experiment with the secret blog?
Not all of you will understand this question. Let me just give a little bit of background. Before my book came out, I made an offer to people. I said that if a person pre-orders this book that I talked about, I would send them the site address of the secret blog, which I've been writing, and it has now, I think, 53 posts. And only pre-orders of the book would get access to the secret blog. I also told people who got the site address not to give it away. What I've learned is that hundreds of people pre-ordered the book to get the secret blog address, which was nice for me, and not one of them has given it away. Even other people in the blogosphere, they made offers like, all you people who've ordered Tyler's book, please, I want you to crack. I want to see that there's a dishonest person out there, and you will give away the address of Tyler's secret blog. And the offers are on the blogosphere, and not one of the book orderers or my readers has done that. So there's a kind of honor here, and I guess it's revised upward on my estimate of people's honesty. And that's what I've learned. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm not going to tell you the secret blog. Yes?
I had a question about the capital gains rate. So you talked about the rate for the capital gains itself, but what about the difference between the capital gains rate and the regular income rate? And does that produce perverse incentives to get your income through capital gains rather than through regular income? And do you think that's valuable or not?
Absolutely it does. The problem is if the capital gains rate is too low, you want everything to be called capital gains and very little to be called income. And that's also a distortion. I think ideally the best tax system, and we're far from it now, we'll probably never get there, would be a tax on consumption alone with some degree of progressivity, with a minimum of loopholes, no housing mortgage deduction. I would keep a charity and nonprofits deduction. That's about it in terms of deductions. I wouldn't have a flat rate, tax consumption. In most European nations, they don't tax capital income much, if at all. But if you're taxing consumption more and labor income less, there's an incentive to shift from one to the other. If you're being taxed when you consume anyway, that incentive goes away. In the meantime, there's some delicate balancing act. But when people compare the labor income rate and the capital gains rate, what they're usually missing is that there really is no one capital gains rate. There's like the one rate in print. And then there's like the rates that come out of using this book. What we really have are like 17 different capital gains rates, depending on how rich you are, how good your accountant is, and so on. And it will never be equal or close to equal to the labor income rate, no matter where we put any of the rates. So it's a problem. We need to jiggle. I don't think now we're at a first best. I don't actually know what side the best setup we would be at. And simply raising the capital gains rate won't automatically give us this better outcome. And ideally, that's tax consumption. Over here, yes?
So, with your discussion of the doctors, when the doctors, are the requirements to become a doctor similar in France and the U.S.? And if so, why don't more people become doctors in the U.S. and drive the salaries down a little bit? And why don't fewer people become doctors in France if they're paid so little?
That's a good question. To some extent, there are legal restrictions, or restrictions coming from the medical cartel, which is a mix of a private force and a legal force. It's hard to sort out how much of that is the law and how much of it is the American Medical Association. And of course, immigration law also plays a role. But the funny thing is this: simply importing more doctors to the U.S., it doesn't seem to lower costs. But the doctors themselves, it's almost like a supply creates its own demand. The more doctors that we have, the more people are served, and costs seem to go up. So maybe at some number of doctors, the wages of doctors would fall. I don't think we're close to the point where we can use that effectively to lower our costs. And it gets back to the medical consumer is not always rational, and you're sitting there like in the waiting office, in the dentist's chair, whatever. They tell you to do something, you're scared, it's hard to say no. What I would like to see, this is a kind of fantasy experiment, I'm not sure how serious this is. I'd just like to see a bunch of floating cruise ships in the Caribbean, not under any national law, with healthcare facilities, with doctors from anywhere, like medical outsourcing. Of course, no one would have to go. You couldn't sue them. I think it'd be pretty cheap. There absolutely would be risks. I'd just like to experiment with that and see what happens. Because right now, you can get on a plane to Thailand, to India, to a lot of different places and buy medical care pretty cheaply. A lot of people do this. It's a lot of routine surgery. You can cross into Mexico and have dental surgery done. It's a lot cheaper. How much more of this can we do? I don't know. How risky is it? I've never seen a good study. But if we really want competitive pressure, take foreigners and stick them into the American medical institutions. Won't really change things. It's that floating cruise ship. This is a mental construct that would be needed. Maybe that can never work. Like, what can you fit on a cruise ship? How reliable is the power? A lot of technical issues that maybe won't work out. But that's what would be needed. And we don't have that. Like I said, I do that as an experiment. Not that I know how well it would work. Yes?
In your comparison to the cost between the United States and France, how did the malpractice cost factor into that?
Surprisingly low. But it's a little bit complicated. Most of the difference in cost comes from what is spent on care in some way, and not from direct legal costs. The direct legal costs are like 2% of the difference. Now, it could be some of what we spend on care is preempted to get out of legal costs. So that's an underestimate. But I think on average, a lot of critics of the American system, they overestimate the cost of malpractice. To me, it's too high. I think it's too easy to sue. It's a problem. I think we should fix it. I'm all for the people who want to change it and make it harder to sue, 100%. That being said, I think if we had perfect malpractice policy, we still wouldn't be happy with what we had. You know, the most general point possible about the healthcare market. Think of it in the most abstract terms possible. Whether it's private care or government care, here's a market, you go to it, they do stuff to you, for a while it hurts, and then you die. Right? That's the basic story. That story is not going to change, no matter who provides it, what you pay, how, whatever. They do stuff to you, it hurts, and you die. And that story is ultimately a hard sell. And it's cloaked in a lot of you're treated well, nice facilities, this is government system, you're covered, private system, they give you this innovation, whatever. But at the end of the day, they put you in a room, they hurt you, and you die. Right? That's the way to think about healthcare markets. Or non-markets, it's a tough sell. Over here?
I've heard a lot of economists that stress the incentives and disincentives, such as you, yet still support a progressive income tax. I was wondering, to me, progressive income tax actually provides disincentives for innovation and productivity on the upper end. The people that succeed and create the cure for cancer would then be punished or have consequences for doing so more than the other end of the spectrum. So I was wondering if you could describe why that is the case, what would be the consequences and rewards of this progressive income tax that it brings forward?
That's a good question, and here's my reading of the evidence. I support progressivity, but I support really a pretty slight progressivity. In my view, tax rates up through 40%. A lot of people don't respond very much. They don't work that much less. When tax rates climb over 40%, and certainly over 50%, the response in terms of people working less, innovating less, whatever, is really pretty significant. So in my view of progressivity, no tax rate should ever approach 50%. I don't even want to see a tax rate over 40%. But let's say we could have a system, some people have calculated this, like if one rate covered everyone, no deductions, what would the number be? It used to be 18, I bet it's changed. Do any of you know the number? Let's say the number is 22. Don't write that down. Everyone could, pay 22%. To me, I would rather have a system where, like, some people are paying 18%, others are paying 24%, others are paying 28%, and everyone paying 22%. I just think where wealthier people can afford to pay more, and they would work a bit less, but not that much less. And I think the earned income tax credit, where at very low levels you pay people to work, I think that's worked pretty well. It's like a negative income tax. So that's not a flat rate either. So as long as the rates are not high, progressivity is fine. If you're, the Beatles song Taxman, the first line in the song Taxman is 1 for you, 19 for me. That's because the tax rate in England at the time was 95%. And a bit later, the tax rate in England, the marginal rate was 102%. Now that is progressive. But it's also crazy. So I believe in mild progressivity. That addresses your question. Yes?
You mentioned how for illegal immigrants their legal status makes them cheaper workers. But the example you used was of a grocery store worker making $10 an hour. How does the statement that they're cheaper because they're illegal jive with the fact that they're often making more than minimum wage? What are the offsetting factors in hiring an illegal worker that would potentially lower their price below, but also maybe raise above the market rate for a legal worker?
No, they don't have a lot of other options. Say you're an illegal worker. No one's going to train you that much. It's probably hard for you to go to school. The odds your English is, or even your Spanish isn't that great, or whatever language you might need. The odds you have problems with languages, communicating with other people, it's a lot higher. Your educational background at home is probably lower. So you're worth less. So no one wants to admit it, but the demand for workers at that level of skill, it's not just a demand for anyone. It's actually a demand for illegal labor. That's the incentive. Because the illegal labor is a lot cheaper. There's because there just aren't that many things illegal laborers can do. If you send someone to the U.S. legally, they and even more of their children are going to be a lot more productive. Even the same human being, legal, is just worth a lot more. It's one reason why people want to be legal. Is that addressing your question?
I guess to a certain extent, but I feel like a lot of those are characteristics of people who are illegal workers, not results of their illegal status per se. Maybe the fact that you wouldn't get as much training, but at the same time, an employer wouldn't have to fill out as many forms to hire someone under the table. That would presumably raise the amount they were willing to pay for that worker slightly. Are there any other things about their illegality specific as opposed to the average skill level?
Well, some of it's a selection effect, but a lot of it's incentives. If you're illegal, the chance that you will marry and have kids in the U.S. and settle is way, way lower. In part, you're just afraid you'll be kicked out, and putting down roots here is complicated. You know, if you have kids quickly enough, you could probably be legal and all that, but still, it's much harder to manage. And also, if you're an illegal, a lot of people don't want to marry you. Put it bluntly, it's harder to find a suitable mate. And what makes men earn a lot more income statistically is when they marry and have kids. It's like, hey, I've got to grow up or I have to support a family. And a lot of illegals have families back home also. So it's also that the incentive is to earn less and have a temporary job and think of yourself as here in the short term and not put down roots. And all of that makes even a person of a given skill level less productive and cheaper. Yes?
I actually thought the question was that the gentleman was asking was, why pay the $10 an hour? Your example has them making more than the minimum wage. That's somebody's question, so I'll make it mine. Well, why does your example have them making $10 an hour instead of $3 an hour when the store owner can get somebody to pay minimum wage? Why are they paying more for someone who represents in some ways a liability?
Well, there are a lot of grocery stores, and if the illegal immigrant produces $10 an hour worth of stuff, that's what the wage gets bid up to. Now, there might be some small towns where there's only one employer and you can get away with paying them much less, but illegal immigrants also know this. They go to big cities where a lot of people bid for their services, and that corresponds to what they produce minus the costs of the legal risk. A lot of the legal risk you slough off onto contractors, of course. That's another incentive, so you're not that exposed. And a lot of these people get forged papers, so you did everything you had to do as an employer. Paper was forged, I didn't know. Nothing so terrible happened to you, and maybe you suspected, but you didn't know. And there you go. That's equilibrium. I think are we out of time, or is there more questions? Or
We can take a couple more questions.
A couple more questions. Yes, here.
Okay, so Medicare Advantage basically. Medicare Advantage basically, like insurance companies get paid a set amount for beneficiaries.
That is to sell you more.
Not Medicare Advantage.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But at least my understanding, my thought is Medicare Advantage, the insurance companies that they can buy, they get a certain amount for beneficiaries, as opposed to Medicare fee-for-service.
Mm-hmm.
So wouldn't that be something similar to the Western European healthcare model, where they just groups get a certain amount of money per. No, I might be able to
But it's not enough because you still get more for serving more patients. The Western European model, you get your $50 grand a year, no matter how many patients you serve. So there's still that huge difference. So it's part of the way there, but you still want to serve more patients. Well, I get what you're asking now. Here's your 50 grand, you're a doctor, work here. Obviously, there's a migration issue, especially with researchers and people at the top. European doctors come to the U.S., but not that many American doctors decide to practice in Europe, again, for the obvious reason. One more question? Yes?
With the example of France, isn't the fact that getting the degrees costs cheaper and just the salary range across the board being cheaper in France for professional services play a role versus the U.S.?
Sure. Tuition is way cheaper in France. You get a lot more vacation. There are certain perks you get more of. You have more control over your lifestyle. So that's part of the reason why it's cheaper. I'm just saying when you look at the statistics and see it's cheaper in France, there's not any simple way through policy you can bring that cheapness to the United States. And cheaper college in France is one reason. Note, of course, U.S. schools are much better, and the French, if anything, are seeking to move to our model, for better or worse. But it's really not a question of the U.S. going in the French education model. The world is pretty much trying to leap onto the American bandwagon there. Anyway, we're out of time. There is an announcement. There is an incentive for you all having come, I think. And
yes, on your way out, we have books laid across the table if you'd like to take a copy of Dr. Cowen's latest book. And please feel free to, any more questions that you might have, to send to us. Our emails are on the webpage, and we'll be happy to answer them. So if you could join me one more time, thank you.